Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. Although we've made a lot of progress in ensuring that our educational system is more equitable and there are more choices for communities and for families for their children, we haven't arrived where we need to arrive. There is still definitely inequity in who goes to which schools, where those schools are, and what the quality of education is at those schools. So it's a question that we still need to delve into, but not to focus on the negative, but also to focus on solutions to this, to create schools that are really going to get at the heart of equity. With that in mind, I'm really excited to be joined by Jenee Henry Wood. She is the author of this great new book on how to design schools with community as part of the process. So a community design school. And the book is called Extraordinary Learning for All: How Communities Design Schools Where Everyone Thrives. She is also Chief Learning Officer of Transcend Education. Transcend does a lot of work in school communities to improve the quality of instruction and education. So I'm really excited to talk to Jenee today, not only about her book, but about Transcend Education as well. So Jenee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John. What an honor to be here. And I'm just so excited to talk about our work and to talk about the work of the communities that we get to partner with.
Awesome. So Jenee, the first question I like to ask folks is, how did you come to focus on community design schools? Why did you feel there was a need to discuss the design process in how we create schools and why we need to really consider community in that regard?
When I first entered the education space, this was in 2009. I was a college student. I was back from studying in the UK, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do. And I thought that I wanted to work in international development. That seemed helpful. That seemed good for the world. But in that process, I took a deeper look at what the life outcomes of children in our country are compared to the life outcomes of children who we would say were more developing societies. And you start to see some pretty troubling statistics about what life outcomes are expected to be of children in the richest society that has ever existed. So where I could channel that at the time, where I could channel getting proximate to these issues, was Teach for America. And so I joined Teach for America as a teacher. I taught in my hometown, and I got very local and proximate to all of the issues that we see. After I was a classroom teacher, so I was a special ed teacher, I taught in 3 different settings: inclusion, resource classroom, push-in classroom. And after that experience, I then went and joined Teach for America staff, and I started working on our national knowledge team. And one of the things that we did on that national knowledge team was we asked the question of what separates some of our highest performing Teach for America classrooms from some of our lowest performing Teach for America classrooms. What are the teachers doing that is different? What are the teachers believing that is different? How are we getting these differences? And can we figure out what those distinctions are in order to improve our program so that we can get many more teachers getting, at that time, what we called significant academic gains? So what I'll tell you is that I left Teach for America with my favorite bit of data that I have ever seen. So I was an economist by training, and then I did a lot of work in just learning and evaluation and applying that skill set. And we did a huge survey of our teachers, thousands of teachers, and we asked them so many questions, John. We were like, how long do you plan? How many teaching books do you read? How long do you spend practicing your lessons? Just all the questions. And what we were trying to do was we were trying to at least find correlation between student outcomes and the answers that these teachers would get. So we were trying to say, we're trying to make it a function. If you do this, will this happen? And the only piece of data, John, the only one that correlated to improve student outcomes was the answer to the following question. The students in this classroom are students that I would want my own children to know. That was the only bit of feedback that correlated. Just think about that for a minute. That was epiphany point number one was, oh, actually it wasn't planning. It wasn't how many degrees you had. It was none of that. It was this human connected belief that the children that you were standing in front of, that those children were good enough, special enough, profound enough in their irreducible humanity to be friends with people that you love, to be friends with your own children. That was the thing that separated our best teachers and classrooms, was that belief. So if you answered that in the strongly agree or agree, chances are your student outcomes in reading and math, you saw like significant growth from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Moment number two is I spent a lot of time when I was at Teach for America in hundreds, almost probably thousands of classrooms in every kind of community, suburban communities, rural communities, urban communities, mainly though urban communities. And what you saw over and over were patterns between all of those classrooms. You saw that number one, the teacher was the hardest working person in the room. They were actors, they were mentors, they were specialists, they were therapists, they were everything. And I eventually started to see patterns, as an economist, but also just as a human who is asking myself, what am I looking at and can I make meaning of it? And I began to see pattern after pattern after pattern, which was all of our teachers, whether you were in a traditional classroom, a charter classroom, anything, you were all in a general box that basically looked the same. The box basically looked the same. The schedule for the day basically was the same. What we changed were the humans. We might have changed the neighborhood and the conditions, but everybody was operating in a box that was more or less the same. And we were working everybody harder inside of that box to get infinitesimal results. In the time since the major days of ed reform, the metric of low-income kids who are now going to and through college in 6 years, I think has maybe moved a percentage point or two. So if you think about that, that's the rough cut. Someone will know it much more specifically. But if you think about that, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of just human work that has gone into this system. And so we began, my colleagues and I, to see it as a system and to see the box as something that is designed, that is surrounding the teachers and that is surrounding the young people and their families and administrators. And that box did not come to us by divine providence. It didn't come down from the sky. We had to build that box. And so that was revelation point number two. What I did think was, I need to run at the design and the box that is limiting the potential of young people and the adults who serve them. And I got there through seeing thousands of classrooms more or less functioning in the same ways. And of course, things have their discrete differences from community to community. But if you were to delineate up and say, okay, what are the main things that all of these share? You just find that everybody is operating within a very well designed and very well defined box that is set up to run itself and to perpetuate itself.
If I can interject there for a second, Jenee, you're really going right into where I was going to go with this, which is we've designed this system and it produced the results it was designed to produce. It's this box system mentality. Generally, teachers are teaching similar ways in similar systems, regardless of whether or not that's a public traditional school, charter school, private school. The question that begs to be answered is, how do we need to design these schools differently for the 21st century?
Great question, John. Let me get into three big ideas that are at the crux of my and my co-author's book. By the way, I'm one of three authors. The two co-founders are also co-authors, Elon Samoha, who's our CEO, and Jeff Wetzler. And we had a real blast trying to sit down and say, what have we learned in these 10 years? There are three big ideas in this book that I would love for people to take away. The first idea is that school has a design and it can be redesigned. We define design, which I think is important to know, as a set of choices, assumptions, structures, and processes that define how, in this case, humans engage with their environment. So everyone might say, a chair, that's definitely a designed thing. My computer, that's definitely designed. Very rarely would someone say, social studies class, that has a design. Math, that has a design. When you walk into the school, it's not just the physical building that is designed, but the experience of school is designed. There are choices that we are making. So school itself has this design. When children get up at some places 6 a.m., they get to the bus, they're at school by 7:05, they're marching into their homeroom class by 7:10, breakfast, da-da-da-da. That is all designed. The schedule is designed. These are practices that are very ingrained in the education system, and they're very resistant to change, much like the grammar of language. But we think it's really important to understand that the managerial designed school that we have now is something that is the result of specific design choices that we have made. And those specific design choices solve problems. And this is what I meant by having a bit more respect for systems. They do solve problems. And we need to talk about it in a slightly more nuanced way. It's not like everything that what we call in our parlance industrial era learning is not everything in industrial era learning is just like awful and bad and you throw it all away. It's not that. Is that there are aspects of industrial era learning that are mimicking societal inequities and are designed to perpetuate them over and over and over again.
So you delineate where good points are in our traditional system and where we need to design differently?
What a great question. Yes, let's tease that out. And I'm going to put this still just as listeners. I listen to a lot of podcasts myself, and they can go in a lot of ways. So at the top of this, I said there are three big ideas of this book. We are still on idea number one, which is the design. And now I'm going to double click into that. So some things that are some things that are good, let me say in quotes, that industrial era learning accomplishes. Let's all, as much as we don't want to do it, let's all go back to COVID. And let's remember what it was like when school stopped on, let's call it March 13th for most people, March 16th officially. When it stopped, families and communities had to figure out, what in the world do we do with our children? How do we get to work? How are we going to work in the house? How are they going to learn? So let's talk about, at the basic lower kind of hierarchy of needs, school, in the way it's designed, accomplishes an important economic goal in many ways, which is, how do you get young people in a synchronized, organized way in a learning environment with adults who are going to, in the best iterations, care about them, help them achieve growth, teach them. School has, at the very base, an important caretaking function. Thing number two is, let's think about some of the accomplishments of the model in terms of getting millions of people to achieve some basic literacy and some basic math skill, what people call the American century. It doesn't look the way it does without this kind of Prussian-based structured managerial model. You just don't get it. So it has accomplished, I think, a really important floor, at least for literacy. Now, if we're going to go to the flip side and say, but what are some of the things that it really limits? Well, there are characteristics of the model that I think are really important for us to examine. The first characteristic is the idea of all school age children who are of the same age going through the exact same material at the exact same time, batched in grades, moving with a bell and doing 8 subjects in a day. Just that concept of synchronicity, that lack of customization, the idea that everyone needs to be doing the same thing at the same time, that structure is a design choice. And what we have found, the data show us, is that that really leaves behind a significant portion of young people and talent that learn in a different way and need to engage in the world in a different way. The next thing it's done with industrial era learning is that it has mechanized how we think about learning, how we think about the brain, how we think about socialization. And what we've actually learned through the science of learning and development is that learning is deeply social. It is not just mechanical. But industrial era learning has designed schools where learning is very rote, it's very departmentalized. You go to math, and then you go to science, and then you go to history. And maybe if you're lucky, you're in a school that's doing some projects across all of them. But for the most part, your learning is going to be extremely compartmentalized. That creates lots of different issues, but it particularly creates a space where there is a deep focus on the cognitive aspects of learning and a much more limited focus on the emotional aspects of learning. And what we know is that it's not one or the other. Both matter because they reinforce and support each other. So when you have a mechanized design that treats learning in a mechanized fashion, you don't then get to benefit from the dynamic engagement of both of those ways of being. And that creates really disparate outcomes for young people, particularly our neurodivergent learners, people who learn differently. It becomes really difficult. So that's a look at the design. That's a look at the design of the system, that point number one, and some of the good things it's accomplished, but also some of the very difficult implications it creates.
I love what you're saying. We've done on the podcast a number of shows on project-based learning, maker spaces, how to embed social emotional learning in learning. Because like you're saying, Jenee, yes, the traditional model has enabled us to synchronize and to ensure that millions of people get educated. But again, it's not customized for the needs of those individual learners like you're mentioning. Now that we're on this topic, I would love, Jenee, to know from you, what's the next iteration of schooling? How should we be designing our schools to take into account this customization that you're bringing up?
Great. I'm going to connect it to my first big point of there are 3 ideas that I want for listeners to take away from this interview and from the book. The second is the idea that we have got to make really big leaps away from traditional approaches toward what we call 21st century, extraordinary 21st century learning. We have a framework that we call the leaps for equitable extraordinary learning. The leaps, I think, are really important because we are trying to articulate a second family of needs that school needs to serve. Everyone is very familiar that schools need to get academic outcomes, and we often talk about outcomes in that way. But what we haven't been talking about is the actual experience of school. What does it mean for a school to have a narrow focus in industrial era learning? So you're going to learn science, you're going to learn math, you're going to learn rote skills, versus a much more whole child focus. What does it mean for a school to go from a one-size-fits-all to a much more customized and personalized approach? What does it mean for schools to go from isolation to a relationship-rich connection and community focus? So what our framework of the leaps is trying to articulate, the next terrain that we need to be thinking about is both the experience of school and the outcomes of school. The experience itself matters tremendously for learning. And we know that because of everything the science of learning and development and brain science has taught us about how learning actually sticks. So we in this framework have kind of split the world into, and of course, all models are broken, some models are useful. So let's focus on how this model is useful. On the left side of this model, we have the core characteristics of the experiences of industrial era learning. In general, it is a rote focus. In general, it's very narrow. In general, it is a one size fits all. That's what's on the left. On the right, we've articulated how we believe that the experiences of school need to evolve so that children are in much more dynamic, futuristic learning environments where they're getting the kind of skills they need for the world that we know exists today. That is focus on the whole child. That is much deeper customization. That is thinking about social responsibility in action. So not shoving the world off and saying school is about reading, writing, and arithmetic only. That is holding unlimited high expectations for all young people. For us, there is this relationship, this dynamic relationship between experiences and outcomes, and we need to expand our understanding of what school is trying to do, what the purpose of school is, if we're truly going to design these learning environments where young people are going to come out with the range of skills for jobs that we can't even predict. So we've got to really think about that purpose. And I think the LEAPS is a framework that helps give us the language for that.
So Jenee, where does community come
Yeah.
into play in the development of these experiences?
Perfect question, John. So this is one of my favorite. This is big idea number 3 that I want for our audience to walk away with. We believe that you've got to answer, how do you do this? And so for us, the answer of how a community gets there is through a process that we call community-based design. And that is what we believe is going to help communities actually make the leaps. So what is it? Community-based design is a strength-based approach to school change. And what it is the belief that educators, young people, caregivers, and experts come together in a collaborative process to reimagine every aspect of school. And that the act of going through that process together, asking those profound questions together, is going to create environments that are just going to be a lot more intellectually engaged, emotionally connected, and stimulating. Now, let me share 2 archetypes for how we've normally pursued school change and where we think we're finding a third way. Archetype 1 has been, generally speaking, I know that there are outliers, so I'm going to speak in generalities, but archetype 1 is that we are talking about top-down initiatives, maybe by a visionary leader. So maybe you get a rock star superintendent, they've got a vision, they might have a team of 1 or 2 people, they come in, they're hired by the board, they've got a lot of initial energy, they want to make their stamp. They start making their stamp, and what's the average? 2 to 3 years. After 2 to 3 years, they leave, and all of those initiatives are in the pile, and then the process starts anew. That's one archetype for change. The second archetype for change is we're doing things that are a lot more bottoms up. Maybe it is parents coming to the board meetings and saying, we want to engage and we want more time for recess. We want much better reading instruction. Our children are not actually able to read. What's going on there? Much more bottoms up. You can have individual teachers making changes. That's a second archetype for how we pursue change. There's goodness in that, of course, because that is involving teachers, caregivers, young people. But what's hard is some of that change never actually makes its way up to the system, to that system level. So both of the archetypes, the ways that we've often pursued change in school, in the school landscape, have been top down, either Washington policy, superintendent, or they've been bottoms up, and they don't always meet in the middle. What community-based design is trying to do is to have those 2 forces meet in the middle and sit at the table together. And that's really important because we think that there is so much knowledge and richness that comes from that interdisciplinary approach, and that comes from the idea that people have different perspectives on learning. And some of those are more valid than others, let's be clear, but they're all helpful in stewarding what an experience might look. That's the basic idea for our how.
What does this look like? What have you and your co-authors have seen in terms of meshing these 2 archetypes to almost create a third type where you have the community buy-in in the design? And I know in your book, I believe in your book, you give some examples of communities done this. Can you walk us through, maybe not all 4 examples, 2 examples of the school communities in which you and Transcend have worked, how
Sure.
they're doing this community designed schooling process?
Yes, and I will give the top level view because I want y'all to buy the book. But let's talk about Northern Cass. So let's go to the cornfields of North Dakota. This is one of my favorite communities that I've had a chance to see our wonderful design partners. Those are the folks in our organization who work in schools day to day. I have the privilege of being able to talk about their work, to make meaning of their work, and to tell the story, but they are actually doing the work, and I'm grateful to them. So in Northern Cass, I'm going to introduce you to a superintendent named Corey Steiner. He is one of these very ebullient, fun, lovely basketball coaches, ton of energy. And he knew that his school was just fine. Like that's how he would describe it to you. It was fine. Kids woke up, they went to school, some went into workforce, some went into military. And he had just a series of moments where he thought, this fine is just not good enough for our young people. They need a very different experience that is so much more personalized, that is preparing them for the world that is out there. And we want for the Northern Cass District to be able to do that. Well, what he did first was he said, you know what I'm going to do? Get rid of grades. I don't need grades. What we're finding is that the grades are making the kids focus on the end point as opposed to learning. And the point of all of this is learning. Well, that did not go over how you thought it would go over. He recalls having parents call him and scream at him on the phone, having parents come into his office and say, you have absolutely ruined my child's ability to go to college and have a good life. Grades need to come back. What are you doing? No, sir, this is not working. So that was change number one. Change number two, he said, okay, we got to walk that one back. Let's do another change. Let's do this. Let's make eighth grade something that you can do at your own pace online. So let's have some volunteer kids. I think they started very small with like 5 or 6 kids. No, I think it was 8 kids. Let's start really small. And y'all are going to go learn in a computer lab and you're going to go at your own pace and it's going to be totally self-directed. And this was before COVID. Well, the children let them know how they feel about that. They said, this is awful. We miss our teachers. We miss talking. We miss relationship. We do not like this. We don't want to do this. I tell those 2 stories, and there are more stories, and I'll get to their final innovation. But I want to note that what both of these stories were missing was they had the bright visionary idea, but what they missed was going to the community and actually getting their opinions about what might work and what might not work. So they weren't actually engaging what was going on and what young people needed. So then Dr. Steiner said, you know what? I think we've got to approach this really differently. And they started having some community meetings. And the truth is, they started doing this before Transcend had anything to do with it. We do not believe that we are just the bringers of community-based design. So many communities that already have this in their DNA, in their bones, and they just need to discipline it. And that was Northern Cass. So he started this process of talking to young people, of talking to parents, and then they identified a problem that they had that was directly in front of them. They had a group of seniors who didn't have enough credits to graduate, and they needed to figure out, how do we make it so that these 12 students can actually get deep, rich, and engaging learning? So they had a problem that was in front of them. They had asked the community about that problem. And what they did was they went out into the world. They didn't start from scratch, but they went out into the world and they said, what other communities have been trying to solve this very same problem? And this is where they borrowed from Building 21. They borrowed from other organizations who've used project-based learning, and they created something called the Studio course. This Studio course, the first iteration of it, was all about getting credit recovery for a group of seniors. But after that first experience, they heard from seniors, this would have kept me so much more engaged in school. And it was from having a process where they listened to teachers, they listened to caregivers, they listened to young people, and they asked, what is the specific issue that we need in our community? And they heard that relevance, that rigor, deeply mattered, and that young people were not finding their learning relevant or rigorous. And so the Studio process, they took it from using this process to help seniors get credit recovery to making this process something that is optional for high schoolers to do as part of an interdisciplinary course. And now they are expanding it to make a version of Studios available to all middle schoolers, on the idea that you have to give children and young people exposure to a lot of different ideas so that they know what they want to do. And most importantly, as Dr. Steiner would say, what they don't want to do. They are a really great example of using something that is at the core of community-based design, which is called design cycles. And we as educators are all familiar with the idea of learning something, envisioning something, building something, and testing it out. And that's at the core of community-based design. You are always constantly going through this cycle where you are designing something, testing it very quickly and getting data, getting some input, getting some reflection and feedback, and doing it again. That is the engine of community-based design. And I think that Northern Cass is a great example that shows how to do that.
Playing devil's advocate, where are the challenges in community design schooling or schools? And how do you and Transcend recommend navigating those challenges?
Well, that's a big question that probably needs to be book 2. So let me let's do the outline of book 2, but I'll keep it at some of the biggest things that we've learned and heard that we have tried to also address in the book. So I would say the first thing is creating the protected space for innovation and design in schools. That is actually problem number 1. And here's why. Schools are not designed to be research entities that are constantly improving themselves. They're not. They're actually designed to execute on a design. When you look at a school and you think about how it functions, it is an execution-based entity. Here is the test, here is the schedule, here is the day, here are the humans, run the day. That's really different than how we've structured a lot of other industries. When you think about medicine, the doctors are not all the same people who are doing the research on the medicine, testing the medicine and running the trials and prescribing the medicine. You've got teams of R&D that are thinking about that work. In aeronautics, the pilots are not the people who are also building the plane. But in education and schooling, we actually have condensed all of the different functions of how you run a really big segment of your society into one little place, the school. That has been the basic, and you can expand out a bit and say the system. But in general, the system is built to run and maintain itself. So what is really hard in schools is to get the time that it takes to say, we are going to do something different, because the model is not built for that. The model doesn't have 2 hours a day where teachers are sitting back and thinking, what could math look like if I reimagined it with some of the principles of learning and development? What would my math lesson look like? We don't really have the time to think of that at scale. So problem number 1 is the dedicated space for innovation and how you push that forward. Problem number 2, keeping innovation journeys alive through human capital shifts. Teachers are in and out, superintendents are in and out. That continuity of the journey is really challenging. Well, we have thought of ways to have more of the community hold this work, but it's very true that the constant dynamic shift in who makes up a school and a system it's just true. Maybe by the time a family gets innovation, their kid, was in 9th grade and now they're in 12th grade, they're not coming back to the design meeting. So you have a whole nother group of people who are thinking about the work. The next thing, one of the biggest things is funding. No school has in their budget a research and development budget. I wish they did, but no school has that. And it is not built into the DNA of education to have and to think about and to hold funds for R&D. And so it's just not in the core makeup of how we run schools. And that lack of funding means that some of the schools that most need to go through a community-based design process are not able to access it. Now, we are trying to do our best to meet community by what we call democratizing our design supports. Our book is one way where we're just trying to get this in as many hands as possible, because we actually do believe that with the right tools and support, people can get started on this journey and learn a ton from it. You might not be able to hire one of us, a design partner, but you might be able to get some tools off the internet, get our book, and have that be plain everyday language that people can run at, because so much of these habits, John, are already built into how educators view the world, but we just need to bring some structure, systemization to it, some frameworks to it, some intention to it. And we believe that community-based design is one way to do that.
So we've talked about the ways that school communities can go about creating these community design schools. We've even talked about some examples of how this looks in practice and some of the things to look out for as you are designing a school with community in mind. But what have we not discussed about community design schools that you feel our listeners should know?
I have found over the last 10 years that I have been working in this space is that it has given me newfound belief in the idea that people coming together actually is deeply important and impactful and matters. But what we need is the structure, the support, the language to work together and to talk together and to do work in common purpose together. And I think community-based design is a beautiful place. Community-based, when we're thinking about our schools, is a really beautiful place to start because it is the wellspring for so much that matters in society, our young people. So for me, I think the thing that we haven't really touched on that I would want for people to walk away with is that we are talking about schools, but at a macro level, we're also talking about whole body politic, the whole way our communities work together. And we need practices and approaches that are bringing our communities together, not tearing them apart. And community-based design is one of those things that's getting people around the table who might look at each other and ostensibly have very different views on things. But at the end of the day, what they want is for their children to be loved, to be successful, and to find a life of meaning and purpose that matters to them. And this process can create the space for communities to have that discussion. And that feels important now more than ever, John.
Jenee, where can people find out more about you and the wonderful work you do?
Great. 2 places. You can meet us on transcendeducation.org. You can find us on LinkedIn at Transcend, and then at a bookstore near you or bookshop, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, you can find our book, Extraordinary Learning for All, How Communities Design Schools Where Everyone Thrived. Thank you so much for having me, John.
I'm glad to have you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.